Hey, welcome back. This time we are talking about the carbon cycle. We just talked about nitrogen and how it flows between the biotic and abiotic things. This time we're going to focus on carbon. And carbon is probably a little more familiar to you because you know, or you should know, right? Plants take in carbon dioxide. We breathe out carbon dioxide. You've probably heard something like that before. This is just a quick little visual on that and some things that we're going to go over. So you can see that here, like carbon's released, like there's a living thing, little raccoon down there, Ricky the raccoon. He is releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Also, cars and industry and anything that burns the fossil fuels, if you look down on the bottom, can be released into the atmosphere as well. And then that carbon dioxide is used by plants for photosynthesis to make food, which are then eaten by the animals. Okay, and again, like we talked about in nitrogen, those plants and animals can die and then also have some carbon return to the soil as well. Okay, so we're going to go through those processes. But first of all, let's talk about where do we find carbon in living things and non-living things? Why do we even need carbon? And for us, like in our bodies as living organisms, carbon is the main, like the backbone of all of our organic compounds. So all of our proteins, which we have to have, nitrogen was there too, but carbon is like the backbone of things. It's kind of like the framework of a house. Like if you don't have those 2x4s, like you don't have it. So carbon is like that backbone. And so the carbohydrates, the proteins, the nucleic acids or DNA, RNA, lipids, which are fats. We don't want too many of those, but we do have to have them. They're essential for our body. So they're the building blocks of all of those organic compounds in living things. So we must have carbon in our bodies. And then since it is in living things, it can also be found in fossil fuels. Because remember, fossils were once living. And so when they die, and eventually if they do develop into fossil fuels, then they're still going to have carbon there. And that's why when we burn them, it releases some of that carbon back into the atmosphere. And speaking of atmosphere, how does carbon exist in those abiotic, non-living things? Well, in the atmosphere it is carbon dioxide, carbon C, di, 2, oxygen, so CO2 is that formula for carbon dioxide. So when you see that, you see it right here, CO2, the little 2 is a subscript. That means there's 2 oxygens, only 1 carbon. That's how it exists in the atmosphere. But it's like nitrogen. Even though carbon dioxide is there, we breathe it in, but we breathe it right back out. It doesn't combine in our blood or like with the oxygen that goes to our cells. Like we don't get carbon dioxide that way. So it's there in the atmosphere. It can also be found in other abiotic things. There's a lot in the ocean. Sometimes it's even called a carbon sink because it'll get stuck in there for so long. In rocks, even diamonds have a lot of carbon, like it's very compressed carbon. So you can find them lots of places. All right, so let's move on to how is it cycled. These are the processes we'll be focusing on. And you have photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Skipping over there a little bit right now because we're coming back and spending a lot of time on them. But for now, let's go over the bottom 3 right here. Okay, so you have, in addition to photosynthesis and cellular respiration, you have combustion. And combustion is just burning. And when we burn things like those fossil fuels or even wood, because there's carbon-based compounds in them, it does release carbon dioxide to the air, which is one thing they say, reason we're damaging the atmosphere so much is because we're burning so much of those fossil fuels. We're putting too much carbon in the air, okay? But that's combustion. And you also have decomposition. Talked about that in the nitrogen cycle. Okay, anytime things are decomposed by those bacteria and fungi, those nutrients that are in them get recycled. Okay, so some of that carbon goes back into the atmosphere. Well, from the decomposers, they go back in the atmosphere, and some of that carbon goes back into the soil as well that can be then reused. And then the last one is digestion. Like that's just when you digest things, you eat them, right? And that's how we get carbon in our bodies. And the same thing with nitrogen, how we got that in our bodies. Like we don't get it by breathing. We have to actually eat things. So we eat plants or eat animals, something that has those carbon-based compounds in them. So that is an important cycle of how it goes from one thing to the next, the food chain that we talked about, right? All right, so this just shows those processes, again, coming back to these, but the combustion, fossil fuels, here, as it burns, releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide can be used in photosynthesis by the plants. Plants can be eaten by the animals. Plants and animals die, decomposition back into the soil. Even have volcanoes back here, which can release some carbon dioxide. Didn't mention that a minute ago. And on the left, it shows the same thing, but in oceans. So it does happen in water as well. Okay, so this would be the digestion. That's the decomposition, combustion over there. So let's focus now on photosynthesis. All right, and if you have a fun little song, if you haven't already checked that out, make sure you go do that. Sing along. If you want to do the little country version and opera, throw that in too. It'll be kind of fun. But in photosynthesis, remember, photo means light. Synthesis is to make. And we are not making light. That would be miraculous. We are using the light, not us, the plants, are using the light to make food for them. Okay, and that form of food is glucose. Ose is sugar, and it's kind of the sugar, it's the food that they use for energy, or transformed into energy. So where does that photosynthesis happen in a plant? Okay, mostly the green part, because that's where you find the chloroplast, that organelle that's there. Remember the chloroplast having a blast because it has all that sugar, it's all the food, it's having a party, woohoo! And the main pigment that absorbs the light energy to get that started is chlorophyll. Okay, so chloroplast is the pigment that's in those big green leaves and green parts of the plant that are reaching up toward the sun to absorb the light by that chlorophyll. Okay, so there's a little image of how that happens. And the whole equation, which you do need to know, again, that goes back to the song. That's why I said learn the song. And hopefully it should be kind of familiar anyway, not necessarily the song, but what goes in and out. Because you should know plants take in carbon dioxide, CO2. What do you have to do to a plant to make it live? You have to water it, right? So carbon dioxide and water, in addition to the sunlight, because you have to have some sun, gives you the food, glucose, plus oxygen. Okay, that's what plants give off. So you should know that plants take in carbon dioxide, give off oxygen. So you should know those two things on the end anyway, right? And the reason why you see these other weird numbers in front of it, like there's a lot of sixes all over the place, right? So 6 carbon dioxide, 6 waters give you glucose, which is C6H12O6, and then you end up with 6 oxygens. It's because when you have an equation, you must have a balanced equation. For instance, if I only put in, if you look over here, 1 carbon dioxide molecule, there would be normally 1 carbon in a carbon dioxide. But over here on the other side, if you have glucose, there's 6 glucose molecules, there's 6 carbons in a glucose molecule. So I can't start with 1 and end up with 6. Like, where did that come from? It said in the earlier one that we don't make matter. Like, we can't just make carbon or hydrogen or nitrogen. We have to cycle it through. Like, we have to, if we're going to end up with it, we have to take it in. Okay, so if you want to make like 12 cookies, you can't put the ingredients in for 2 and then magically have 12. You have to put in the right ingredients. So therefore, the numbers of those elements have to match on each side. And you'll do a lot of that in 8th grade. You'll have to balance equations, or in physical science later on in high school, chemistry. So just kind of have a general understanding of that. And when you see it, just know what it means for now, okay? But it has to be a balanced equation. So with this energy too, that solar energy, it's not on either side because it's not, sunlight is not an element. It's not a carbon, it's not hydrogen, it's just energy. And so that's why it goes over the arrow and not on either side with the reactants, because they react together, or the products, because that's what's produced. It is just over that arrow. Okay, so that solar energy is actually being used to excite those electrons to create this glucose, which is the food, some chemical energy, which will then be eventually transferred into the form of energy called, remember, energy, ATP, that the cell actually uses. Okay, so this is how the plant actually makes their food to be converted into the energy. And so how do those things get in the plant, out of the plant? Like, we know they need carbon dioxide, but how does it actually get there? It goes in through little holes on the bottom of the leaf called stomata. Looks like this. There's like a little lips or something, right? It looks kind of cool. And those are actually called guard cells. They open and close and let the carbon dioxide in when it needs to come in. It also lets the oxygen out when it needs to go out. But it doesn't need to stay open all the time because, I mean, is photosynthesis happening all the time? Just think about, what does it need to happen, right? It needs sunlight, and we don't have sunlight 24 hours a day. So during that time when the sun's down, like at night, it closes so it can keep that oxygen, and also water vapor escapes as well. It's called transpiration. You want to keep that water inside as much as possible so it can get all wilty, because it needs the water. So it closes during certain times. So that's how the gases go in and out. There are little holes on the bottom. You can actually, if you want to do that at home, just find a leaf. You can get some clear fingernail polish and paint over it, let it dry and peel it off. And if you have a microscope, you can look under that and you can actually see the shapes of that. You won't see those cool colors like that, but you can actually see the shapes of the stomata all around, and it's kind of cool. All right, and then water, of course, you should know where you water a plant, right? You water the soil so it sucks it up through those roots, and then it delivers it to the rest of the plant from there. Okay, and that shows gases up here, water on the bottom. All right, so photosynthesis, got that, right? Photosynthesis, plants use it to make food, take in carbon dioxide and water, use the light. The whole purpose of it is to make food for the plant, and it gives off oxygen in the process. So carbon is going from abiotic in the air, atmosphere, to the biotic part as glucose inside the plant. Okay, that's where it stays, unless it's eaten by another, or it dies. All right, so next process in carbon cycle, I skipped one, sorry, is cellular respiration. And with respiration, you think about that's breathing. Well, cellular respiration is cell breathing, right? Cell is breathing in that oxygen. So it involves our respiratory system too, and we'll get to that when we get to human anatomy. But how it's involved with the carbon cycle is when we take in the oxygen as well as we eat the glucose, the carbon compounds. Okay, so we take that in, those go to our cells to make ATP, energy. And do you remember where that happens? Is the powerhouse, or the mighty mitochondria, is where that energy is made. And all cells need ATP, plant cells, animal cells. So even though plants make their food, they still have to convert it into ATP. Okay, so plants have both chloroplast and mitochondria. They do both things. We don't make our own food. We just eat food, and then it goes to our mitochondria. Okay, so this is actually your ATP molecule down here on the bottom. If you look at, I don't know if you remember this, but it looks pretty, sorry, my Molly Jo's getting a little crazy over there. It has a ribose and adenine. It looks kind of like an RNA molecule, but instead of having one phosphate, there's actually 3 on the end. That's why it's called adenosine triphosphate, because it's an adenine and 3 phosphates, and energy is stored in those bonds. You don't really have to remember that. Just know that ATP is the energy. It's made in the mighty mitochondria. Okay, so if we look at that whole equation, it should look kind of familiar, right? Because you got glucose and oxygen, and that gives you carbon dioxide and water, and then you make some ATP in that. So it's the same stuff, right, as photosynthesis, what you just learned, what we talked about, but you just flip it around. So if you know one, you know the other one, because it's just backwards, okay? So again, if you never learned the song, then you just write it down. The only thing you don't have is sunshine over the top, because we don't have to lay out in the sun to break our food down, and then you're making ATP over here at the end. You don't need to remember the number, but just know ATP is made in cellular respiration, okay? And how do we get that glucose? We talked about the oxygen we breathe in, the glucose we eat, right? That's where that comes from. Plants, on the other hand, make the glucose in their chloroplast, and they're making oxygen too, so they can just use some of that instead of just giving it all off. They use some as well, and they use that. All that gets sent to the mitochondria, where it then carries out cellular respiration. Okay, so again, remember what those organelles look like, because this is a great little visual. I know it used to be on a test that we had. So you have the chloroplast here, where it absorbs the light energy, and it shows the organic molecules, which is making glucose, is what that means, and oxygen goes into the mitochondria. which uses those two ingredients, the reactants, to make ATP. And remember, lots of heat is lost. That whole energy pyramid thing, a lot of heat is lost along the way. And then some of that is used to create ATP, and then it releases carbon dioxide and water as those waste products. But it's not waste products for the plant. It's good for the plant. So that goes into the chloroplast here. Plants can take that in and carry out photosynthesis again. So you can see the whole cycle. Okay, these are the living things, the biotic, the chloroplast and the mitochondria. And then here, like in the atmosphere, the oxygen and carbon dioxide, all that would be the abiotic part. And we've been over this visual before. This is just another way to show it. It's kind of like I said with nitrogen. It's the same thing. It's just different ways. And if you like one better than the other, then go with it. It's fine. It's whatever works better for you. So this one, you just follow the arrows, and it shows both carbon dioxide and oxygen. Okay, the blue is the oxygen and green's carbon dioxide. Like the carbon dioxide here is going into the plant for photosynthesis. It gives off oxygen, which then goes into the animals. The animals breathe out the carbon dioxide, which can go into the plants. These plants animals die, they can decompose, or if that glucose is here in the plant, it can be eaten by the deer, which is then eaten by the lion. It can be like the ingestion part of this. So like we said with nitrogen, there's not just like one cycle that one carbon molecule goes around for its whole entire life. It can get stuck places. It can it can be in one of those huge trees for like a long time. Trees live a long time. Or it could be very quickly between, a plant, an animal on the ground, and air. And it can travel different places in different orders. So just be aware there's not one way that carbon travels. All right, and lastly, we talked about that combustion, the burning of fossil fuels, and the reason why that's gotten so bad is because there is a layer of carbon dioxide around the Earth, which is good, and the reason for that is because when the sun shines in, it bounces back off, and that heat energy hits that layer of carbon dioxide, and it keeps the heat in. Because if it didn't, we would be like freezing cold all the time, so it's kind of like a blanket on your bed. But with all of our burning of fossil fuels, more and more and more, it's just like when you get a thicker blanket on your bed, you get a thicker layer of carbon dioxide. So the theory is that the thicker that layer, the more heat that it's going to hold in. And that's what's leading to the greenhouse effect and global warming. And there's still a big debate about that, but that's the whole theory behind it. Okay, another thing we're doing is like cutting down trees, which also has an effect on that too, right? Because if you cut down all the trees, they're not taking carbon out of the air, so there's more carbon dioxide there. They're not taking it out anymore. They're not putting as much oxygen in. So that also has an effect on that carbon-oxygen cycle too. Okay, so that's all for a carbon cycle. And if you have questions, let me know.